Hi, everyone. I think people are arriving. I can see our apologies for the slight delay in us broadcasting and starting. We had to sort out some technological difficulties, and hopefully we have sorted them out right now. And yeah, so we're just waiting for the attendees to arrive and for that number to sort of stabilize. So let's give this maybe a few more seconds and then we're gonna start. I think it's fine now. Yeah, okay, excellent. All right. So yeah, so this is the second webinar in the webinar series, Disability in Health, Inequalities in Times of COVID-19. And this specific webinar is about education. And we have there's 5 webinars in total. We had 1 webinar already last week, and this is the second one, and there will be 3 more. We are the British Sociological Association's Disability Study Group. You will see Sarah somewhere over there, and Lindsay, who's also of the Disability Study Group, my co-host, and Lindsay is of the BSA itself. So from our side on Zoom, those of you who attended last time already know, who have attended other Zoom seminars or webinars know that we actually cannot see you. We only know how many attendees there are, but you can hopefully see us. Yes, so perhaps it might be useful to know that we all are trying to do our best. However, as we noticed last week, there will be some Zoom glitches, there will be technological glitches, and obviously there will human mistakes. But we do our best to respond to everything on the spot and to have this webinar go as smoothly as we can, and technology allows us. So just bear with us, please. This week we will do it slightly different from last week. So last week we had 4 presentations in a row and then we took all questions. This time we have 1 presentation, then we will take question, and then there will be another presentation and we take the rest of the questions for that presentation. So this is just for you sort of to know and be prepared how we go about this. Both presentations are, well, there's one pre-recorded presentation and 1 live presentation, but they're not in Google. So Sarah will be inputting the transcript in the chat. So, and if you want to, you can have the chat float above the shared screen, above the Zoom. So you can sort of like choose where you put the chat with the transcript. So if you want to follow the transcript alongside with the oral presentation, then please feel invited to do so, okay? What is important is that we have disabled the chat function, meaning that the attendees cannot actually chat. You can actually not chat among yourselves or with us. The reason for this is that it would make it impossible for people to follow the transcript. So this is the reason that we opted for disabling the chat function. Okay. So, however, we really would like you to ask questions, and we will want to try to answer as many as possible. So what we want to do is for you to write down all your questions in the Q&A, which should be around here in the bottom. So if you hover with your mouse sort of at the bottom of your screen, the Zoom screen, there is a pop-up with Q&A, and over there you can ask questions to us and to the other panelists. So one of us will sort of have a look at these questions. If they're really urgent questions around audio or other things, I will respond to it. And for the rest, we will get to these questions at the end. So you don't have to wait asking your questions till the end. You can put them in the Q&A box already. So you don't have to keep them in your mind. You can sort of offload them already, and then we get to them during the Q&A, okay? Yeah, so at the end of each of the presentation, the 2 presentations that we have around perhaps 8-10 minutes for questions, and then unfortunately we have to wrap it up. So if so if you have any other questions, then at some point it might be best to contact the presenters themselves if you want to have a further conversation, obviously, okay? Yeah, so we really would like, we will try to maybe end around 4:45 to keep it a little bit shorter, but we started slightly later, but maximum 5 because everyone is a lot on Zoom these days, so we don't want to make it too long, let's say. All right, so we have 2 presentations. My apologies. So Stefan Sunandan Honisch is the first panelist who will present first. He's a Benting postdoctoral fellow in theater and film at the UBC, the University of British Columbia. And his presentation is called Disability as Virtuality, Universal Design for Learning in Extraordinary Times. The second presentation is by Seamus Byrne and Dr. Amel Alghrani. They're respectively a lecturer and reader in law at the University of Liverpool. And their presentation is called Children with Special Educational Needs and Disability in COVID-19. Okay, so we're starting now with Stefan's presentation. And yes, so there's a question already whether it's a recording afterwards. Exactly, there is a recording afterwards. So once the BSA is up and running with, I think in a few weeks, they will transform it and put it on YouTube and send this to everyone. Thank you, Lindsay, for sharing your screen already. So if everyone is ready, Sarah, are you ready? And Stefan?
Stefan, ready with the title slide?
Are you ready, Stefan?
Thank you very much.
Yes, okay, I'll spotlight you. So yes, I would say, Stefan, thank you for joining us with your presentation, Disability as Virtuality, Universal Design for Learning in Extraordinary Times. And I'll mute myself, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you all for joining for today's presentation. My name is Stefan Sunandan Honisch, and I am a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Theatre and Film at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin with a territorial acknowledgement. Today, I'm speaking with you from St. John's College on the campus of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. St. John's College and the University of British Columbia campus are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. I guest on the traditional lands of the Musqueam people. I position myself as a disabled scholar, educator, and musician of East Indian and German descent. The image title for this is Coastal Mountains of the Salish Sea. And what this photograph shows are the snowy mountains rising above the coastal waters of the Salish Sea off the south coast of British Columbia in Canada. Next slide, please. So I'd like to begin with an overview of the presentation. My presentation today is divided into 3 parts. I'll begin with a review of the guiding principles of universal design for learning. Then I'll frame disability as virtuality, recovering one of its now obsolete meanings as, quote, something endowed with force or power, close quote. And finally, I will locate within universal design for learning an expansive series of places to continue in which we commit to being in solidarity with communities of color in the struggle against anti-Black racism, trans exclusion, and ableism. Next slide, please. Universal design for learning is an educational framework that challenges fictive constructions of, quote, ideal and, quote, normal learners. Within its spacious parameters, disability is understood as one of the manifestations of learning diversity around which educational interactions and activities should be planned, indeed designed. The metamorphoses of COVID have pulled disabled corporealities into renewed focus, raising the question of what universal design for learning might mean for disabled learners and disabled educators navigating the virtual platforms of post-pandemic pedagogy. As we contemplate this question, it will be helpful briefly to review the core principles of universal design for learning. So the three principles that are often cited are multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, multiple means of engagement. Today's exploration of the possibilities and limits of universal design for learning locates education as a point of convergence, one aptly described by Jennifer Sandlin, Brian D. Schultz, and Jake Burdick as, quote, an enveloping concept, close quote, in which intersecting forms of privilege and oppression complicate the struggle for equality and justice. Within what they characterize as the enveloping concept of education, I would like to situate two recent statements of solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Working through these statements will help us think about the place of disability within universal design for learning in new ways, finding degrees of continuity and stability in these extraordinary times through its open-ended teaching and learning practices, while recognizing, importantly, what we need to unlearn and unteach as we collectively dismantle racism, ableism, and trans exclusion. The first of these statements comes jointly from the Center for Applied Special Technology, CAST, and the Universal Design for Learning Implementation and Research Network, UDL-IRN, bringing out important material connections between formal education and public life, while reminding us that injustice and inequality are not exceptional, but are indeed part of the very design of teaching and learning, and more fundamentally of simply being in public that, quote, robs so many people of hope and opportunity, close quote. The second of these statements frames the present webinar series, affirming that the British Sociological Association's Disability Study Group is in solidarity, quote, with our disabled and non-disabled trans and Black and Brown audience members, presenters, colleagues, and communities against anti-Black racism and trans exclusion. When considered within the context of existing and emerging forms of solidarity and collective resistance then, the multiple forms of representation, action, and expression and engagement that constitute universal design for learning's guiding principles push us towards the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and disability that shape formal teaching and learning in schools and universities. Outside these institutional walls, the intersections just mentioned lie at the core of what Carmen Luke has called, quote, the public pedagogies of everyday life. I'd like to describe the image on this slide, which show the three principles of universal design for learning. There are three-dimensional squares in front of each of the three UDL principles that I've summarized above. Next slide, please. In his foreword to the recent anthology, Transforming Higher Education Through Universal Design for Learning, David Rose, the co-founder of the Center for Applied Special Technology, argues that despite its ambitious reach, universal design for learning is, quote, too parochial, close quote. I join with David Rose and others in pushing beyond the present limits of universal design for learning. And crucially, David Rose points to the question of understanding, quote, what the universal in universal design for learning really means, close quote. In the second part of my presentation, I will suggest that the universal might be reimagined in productive ways by recovering a lost meaning of virtuality, one that has to do with possibility and potential. By placing this recovered semantic artifact alongside disabled ways of being, I suggest, we tune our pedagogical instruments more sensitively both to the multiples that current iterations of universal design for learning span, and to the multitudes that each of us contain in our educational practices. Recent conversations about how to practice effective online teaching and learning for the unforeseeable future continue to sideline disability and access needs. There's a great deal of concern, and rightly so, about the difficulties involved in recreating the interactive dynamics of face-to-face teaching and learning within online platforms. However, the extent to which the rapidly evolving educational landscape might allow for greater flexibility and for more inclusive ways of embracing different access needs, including those needs more fully welcomed in virtual than in traditional environments, remains a topic in need of more sustained attention. In similar ways, the discourse surrounding universal design for learning risks marginalizing disability at times through the habit of signaling that UDL practices will, quote, benefit all learners, not just those with disabilities, close quote. To this extent, that is, in the habit of passing quickly over disabled participants in education, there is some measure of continuity between the period of time I somewhat humorously characterize as BC, before COVID, and the present moment. These extraordinary times are fixed as a crisis, and in an unforgettable recent article by Arundhati Roy, they are mapped as a portal which invites our presence, quote, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world, close quote. While the scope of today's presentation does not allow us to linger within the space that Arundhati Roy thereby reveals, our task is similar in a key respect. It is driven by a shared concern with imagining and bringing about a different educational world in which universal design for learning becomes a curricular and pedagogical portal to anti-racist intersectional pedagogies. My characterization of these times as, quote, extraordinary recognizes Rosemary Garland Thompson's pivotal analysis of how disability signifies, quote, superabundance rather than lack, close quote. Although my own entry point is the pedagogical rather than the literary, there is congruity in that her chosen adjective admits an extraordinary range of representations, of actions, and modes of expression and forms of engagement. Disabled instructors and learners have long struggled to have our access needs recognized in higher education, as Amy Hamrai has pointed out, among others. Elizabeth Brewer, Melanie Yergo, and Cynthia Self explain that, quote, when access is only a question of texts, products divorced from laborers, those individuals seeking access are positioned as consumers, as bodies in need of help from those more able and privileged, close quote. Central to resisting such forms of exclusion is the important distinction that they make between consumptive and transformative access. As they explain, quote, consumptive access allows people to enter a space or access a text. Transformative access, on the other hand, questions and rethinks the very construct of allowing, close quote. The educational power and force of disability in this public health crisis, then, lies in its as yet unrealized potential to bring about transformative rather than consumptive access. As an extraordinary way of being in the world, disability can carry out what Rosemary Garland Thompson calls its, quote, world-making work as we step lightly through the portal that Arundhati Roy has found in this crucial moment. Next slide, please. My main theoretical move, then, is to tease out the implications of disability virtuality for universal design for learning, or at least to begin laying the foundations for making that work possible. In embracing a commitment to disability virtuality, universal design for learning might reimagine the myriad interactions of teaching and learning by balancing its practical focus on what actually happens in our educational practices with an abiding concern for what could happen if we move through the learning portal that this moment of crisis is creating. Moving towards and ultimately through this portal, universal design for learning frameworks will need to leave behind neoliberal relics of the old pre-pandemic world, with its incremental fixes, minute adjustments, and the restrictions imposed by capitalist logics of cost and benefit. Embracing transformative access might help us move through the portal away from a concern with the universality of our designs for learning, and instead towards an embrace of virtuality. Next slide, please. In closing today's presentation, I would like to locate within Universal Design for Learning's 3 core principles summarized earlier, a series of places to continue. Here, I acknowledge J.T. Dolmage's development of, quote, places to start atop a universal design foundation. In a spirit of continuation then, the way forward must always hold space for being in solidarity with communities of color in the struggle against anti-Black racism, ableism, and trans exclusion. This entails moving through the learning portal beyond what David Rose has identified as the tendency towards parochialism in universal design for learning, and indeed away from the universalizing aspirations of higher education. What I characterize as disability virtuality points always to intersections, junctures, and portals, and not to self-contained units, standard designs, and assigned places. If, as Richard M. Jackson and Scott D. Lipinski have observed, quote, creating accessible classrooms requires more than accessibility compliance, close quote, then realizing disability virtuality within a universal design for learning framework requires continual work at the unstable edges of curriculum and pedagogy, resisting the modularity that would otherwise separate disability and access needs in higher education from collective and intersecting struggles against racism, colonialism, homophobia, trans exclusion, and ableism in all their forms. So I would like to ask to skip to the very last slide, which says, which just offers my thanks for your participation in today's webinar, and I would be happy to respond to your questions.
Many thanks, Stefan, for this really interesting presentation. Lindsay, I think you can stop or unshare your screen if you want to. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, it was very interesting, and I hope that the rest thought it was really interesting as well. I had some questions. There were some questions around, there were some practical issues or questions around the chat. Right now, I would like to ask the audience that we can't see, the attendees, whether they have any questions right now for Stefan or anyone else on the panel. I had a question, but I would like others to ask others if they have a question. So you can, at the bottom of the Q&A box, you can ask your questions. Or if someone else in the panel has a question, would like to ask, I'm happy to go first as well. Sorry, I just have to find my question. Yes, here. Okay, so Stefan, really thank you for this. At some point, you mentioned that the educational power and force of disability in this public health crisis lies in its unrealized potential to bring about transformative rather than consumptive access. And I think a lot of us, I'm disabled myself, and I think a lot of disabled, I want to say consumers, people who had this new online educational world, either as students or as lecturers or teachers, that we realize that there is this whole new or a different experience. And yeah, I was hoping whether you could sort of speak to that, perhaps what your perspective is on how what that experience is, how it is different, but perhaps also how it is similar, how disabled people might have already experienced some of this. And I'm specifically interested, I'm working with a colleague of mine, Dr. Kelsey Acton, we're working on something called relaxed pedagogy. We're trying to think through that. So I was also interested in sort of like this idea of the post-COVID-19 or COVID-19 classroom and how this can be accessible and thought in a kind of transformative way. So if you would like to speak to that, I'd be really interested in hearing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm also disabled, and I I really like the way you frame your question in terms of both continuity and discontinuity, because my sense at this point is that one of the continuities, unfortunately, is that familiar access barriers from before COVID continue to occur. Right. So things that by now are familiar, or perhaps should be familiar. So things like making sure that images have image descriptions, that fonts are, where possible, not serif fonts, but rather sans serif fonts, which are more accessible. And I think that perhaps another continuity in a not so positive sense between the pre and I was about to say post-pandemic world, but we're not
there. Yeah,
we're not there yet. But the moment that we're in now, at any rate, is that I think that accessibility, this may be linked to the sort of consumptive access model, that accessibility is too often framed as a zero-sum game, or as a kind of all or nothing dichotomy, rather than a way of moving through the world, including through education, that invites us all into a conversation about continually adapting and changing and being flexible. And so this connects, I hope, my response to what I understand to be the next part of your question, which is around the ways in which those conversations that access and ways of being sort of invite us to join. I think I sort of lost my train of thought here. Forgive me, but I think that I had constructed this rather elaborate response, and it's still rather early here.
It's very early for you.
So, yeah, but I think that this idea of maximizing accessibility, and then also from the second part of your question, this idea that there are certain aspects of the online environment that we're all familiarizing ourselves with that perhaps create new possibilities. So I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned the work that you're doing with your colleague around relaxed pedagogy, and that while I'm not familiar with the project that you are doing, which I'd love to hear more about, I do note that there are a number of conversations unfolding now about how to essentially give students a break, or to give students more ways to show up and to demonstrate their knowledge without relying so much on timed testing, on exams, on grades even. And to the extent that online platforms, or certain online platforms, allow asynchronous participation in education, that seems to me a particularly generative way in which there might be a productive discontinuity with the face-to-face learning of the pre-pandemic world. The pre-pandemic world, in which there may have been less possibility for allowing learners and instructors, for that matter, to participate in learning and in education in their own time and in their own space. Yeah,
it's really interesting, because from when you're talking, the word that comes up to me is friction. And there is something around this continuity, discontinuity, this COVID period, this period which is a lot of chaos, definitely us who are teaching, but I also think for those who are being taught, and quite frankly, us teaching we are also being taught by having to teach differently and by the demands and the requests of our students, isn't it? There's something around that friction that almost like there is a possibility for, I wanted to sound change, and that's maybe transformation, I think is a more interesting way of thinking about it, where it is the compulsory aspect of us having to respond to COVID and everything that comes with it, more than COVID almost in itself, how that compulsory this need requires us to transform whether we want it or not. And that can actually have a transformative impact, if you will, or aspect to it in terms of accessibility and inclusive learning or all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, is there any, sorry.
Seamus? Sorry, I think I saw Seamus.
Seamus, do you want to just unmute yourself if you want to contribute?
Yes, Stefan, thank you very, very much for that. It was excellent. And one of the things that I took away from your paper was that you refer to cost-benefit analysis. And that's something that I'm always very interested in, because I think for me, one of the problems with cost-benefit analysis is that it is based on a very reductive economic model. And in relation to the provision of essential services for disabled people, I always find that the cost-benefit analysis, model, which really is the instinctive to-go guide for national governments, for agencies, I find that very problematic, and I think it is the wrong model. I don't think it serves the rights or the needs of anyone well. And I'm just wondering, Stefan, how do you see, how can we move beyond cost-benefit analysis when we move out of COVID-19? And also, perhaps, do you think now is there an opportunity and a space for us to champion a transformative agenda in terms of moving forward for the delivery of services? I think it's probably a bit beyond your paper, but just your reference to cost-benefit analysis for me was very important, because I know here in the United Kingdom, all of our public services are administered on a cost-benefit analysis scheme, and I've always found that deeply problematic.
Right. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Seamus. I really appreciate that. And I think that for me, thinking back also to the statements of solidarity, both from Universal Design for Learning, from the Center for Applied Special Technology, and then also the call that went out to us as participants in today's webinar to be in solidarity with marginalized communities. It seems to me that this moment that we're in which there's a collective, there are collective struggles in the cause of anti-racism, of trans exclusion, and against ableism. It seems to me that this moment, to the extent that there are, at least for some commentators, signs of much more broad-based participation and indeed awareness, that to the extent that there are these new forms, potentially new forms of solidarity emerging within and across marginalized communities, that this can also be part of the struggle against reductive models and cost-benefit analyses, because what this moment calls us, I think, among other things, to realize is that somebody's humanity should never be up for a question, that is never okay. And to the extent that cost-benefit analyses and reductive economic models, I'm borrowing your phrasing here, which I really like, there must also be this realization, I think, then, that these cost-benefit analyses and the models to which they give rise also end up treating people's humanity as, in some sense, debatable or up for question, or as something that can be placed within a hierarchy of more or less legitimate needs. And so I think that maybe there's the potential for a convergence between how we respond to COVID and how we respond in this moment also to the ongoing work of anti-colonialism, of anti-racism, of the struggle for trans inclusion, and for the struggle against ableism.
Can I just, because this was before we go to the last presentation, I think that this point about intersectionality is something really important, but I also think it goes beyond solidarity. And I'm also thinking about when we talk about an accessible classroom and sort of, in this case, in I'm talking about higher education actually, but not everyone is necessarily. I'm also thinking about how, class, for example, might be, or the way that people live, and the way that people have to share technology and all these kind of things, how that is also a limitation to access, which is not in and of itself a disability access, but it becomes a disability access and an intersectional way that we have to think about access and disability. So can you very briefly perhaps say something in relation to your presentation? Can you very briefly maybe make a last point in response to this?
Thank you, Dee. And I don't know that I can do so quickly, so I will perhaps just acknowledge that you've touched on an aspect of my presentation that is still very much active in my mind, and I've been struggling with the question, and I continue to struggle in what I hope is a productive way to honor and recognize these intersections in ways that go beyond, as you were saying in the first part of your statement, that go beyond solidarity and that join the practices of bringing about actual change and material transformation and new ways of imagining how we teach and how we learn, and how we think about education as about much more than teaching and transmitting information and knowledge and absorbing it, but how we link what we do in the classroom and in the university and so forth with how we connect to each other as human beings.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. I think we have to leave it at that. And thank you for the really interesting and really important presentation and conversation. I do realize that it's really early for you and that your day is about to start, really. So for everyone, Stefan unfortunately has to continue with, or has to go to whatever your commitments are right now. But really thank you for being here and so early for you. So thanks for that. Okay, so I'm just going to, so we're sort of in between two presentations, and I want to very briefly acknowledge 2 points in the Q&A that were raised. One is about whether we perhaps can distribute the transcript beforehand. So this is something that we will definitely consider for the following webinar. So thank you for suggesting this. And there was also an explanation by Kwok about how to get rid of the chat box, basically, if this is for some reason interrupting you being able to follow the webinar. So Kwok explains that click on the top left of the chat box and request the chat to pop out. So yeah, try to play around with it so that you individually can sort of adjust sort of the settings of Zoom to your own needs. Yes. Oh, and thank you, Erica, for commenting about how to make that we're making this available and accessible. Yeah, we do our best, and unfortunately, it's not ideal and not perfect, but we try to sort of like learn on the go as clearly. Well, it really speaks to Stefan's presentation, I suppose, how we do this. Yes. So, Seamus and Amel, we're going to your presentation now. I'm just sharing with everyone that we had a slight technological difficulty here, and we are hoping that we are able to solve this as best as possible. If we don't, then well, then we try to fix it as quickly as we can, basically. Okay, so I hope for everyone's understanding. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Sarah will input the transcript. I'm just checking with everyone here as well. And Lindsay, you will check the Q&A just to make sure that there are no massive audio or visual issues. Lindsay and Sarah, are we all? Yes? Perfect. Excellent. All right. So let me get everything here ready. All right. Okay, so this is Seamus and Amel's presentation. It is presented by Seamus. The audio is presented by Seamus, but it is research that is produced by both of them. And it's entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on Children with Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. And I will share my screen now. And I will stop my own video so it doesn't distract and mute myself. And then hopefully this works out fine. Give me 1 second.
Good afternoon. My name is Seamus Byrne, and I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Liverpool. And I deliver this paper alongside my colleague, Dr. Amel Alghrani, who is a reader in law at the University of Liverpool. We both have expertise in children's rights, education rights, and my colleague Amel is also a leading expert in medical law and ethics also. We're really delighted to be part of this very important seminar and this webinar series, which explores the intersection of COVID-19 and disability. While admittedly we are both lawyers, we are keen to open up and to develop opportunities and some discussions around the wider impact which COVID-19 is having on children with special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND for short. We're keen to open up some broader discussions along a multiplicity of different avenues and pathways. So this PowerPoint today is going to outline some of the key findings. So just in relation to the background to the investigation, the background to the study, children with special educational needs and disabilities are one of the most marginalised and vulnerable groups within the English education system. We use the term vulnerable in the sense that as a cohort of individuals, children with SEND have their human rights readily overlooked and in fact undermined. Children with SEND consistently suffer higher rates of exclusion from school than their peers, and they also are more likely to have decreased employment opportunities than their non-SEND peers. And for example, according to the Department of Education, in 2018 alone, 48% of all children who were permanently excluded from school had a SEND, while 43% of all children who were subject to a fixed term exclusion from school were SEND also. And by comparison, children with SEND are 25% less likely to be in sustained employment by the time they reach 27 years of age in comparison to their non-SEND peers. So just in relation to the landscape prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, the human rights of children with SEND are governed by Part 3 of the Children and Families Act 2014. This legislative provision radically overhauled the provision of children's SEND services. And one of the key features of this piece of legislation was that the Statement of Needs, which previously outlined the services which were required to meet the needs of a child with a special educational need, that has been replaced by what's called an Education, Health and Care Plan, an EHC plan. These EHC plans are one of the novelties of the new Children and Families Act. The aim of the Children and Families Act is to now cover the needs of children and young people from 0 to 25 years, with the aim to ensure that they have their needs provided for across all relevant sectors. This also includes their healthcare needs and their social care needs. In this regard, it reflects the reality that children's SEND needs are not just confined to education alone, but rather cover other important areas of children's lives. This includes the interventions which they may require for issues such as speech and language services, for their mental health, or for their behavioural, social and emotional health. The new legislative framework is also supplemented by a new statutory code of practice, which outlines the responsibilities of local authorities, schools, and all relevant stakeholders when it comes to the provision of services for children and young people with SEND. The new framework, pursuant to Part 3 of the Children and Families Act 2014, adopts a person-centred participatory approach to children's SEND services, and central to that is the holistic approach which it embeds. The new framework is designed to accommodate the needs of children's services right across education, health and social care. And just in relation to some of the key provisions of this new statutory framework, Section 19 of the Children and Families Act enshrines the right of children and young people with SEND to participate, to have a say in the matters which affect them, and to have a say in the composition and the configuration of the services which will meet their needs. Another important provision within the Children and Families Act is Section 42. And Section 42 enshrines the absolute duty on local authorities to deliver on the contents of a child or young person's education, health and care plan. There's an absolute duty on local authorities to deliver on the content of a child or young person's education, health and care plan. However, in reality, over the last 4 to 5 years since the enactment of the Children and Families Act 2014 and prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, children's SEND rights were already in a clear state of precarity. There was mounting evidence that local authorities were failing to comply with their legal obligations under the Children and Families Act 2014. These failings involved huge delays in following the legal time periods which the legislation sets down and prescribes. There was delays in relation to children not having their needs assessed within the time frame, and delays also in relation to local authorities not complying with the 20-week framework within which they have to deliver a finalised education, health and care plan. These failings culminated in a House of Commons Education Committee investigation in 2019 into the provision of services for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And this cross-party investigation it uncovered clear evidence of illegalities. It painted a picture of a system where the provision of important and necessary children's services was typified and underscored by confusion, unlawful practices, bureaucratic nightmares, buck passing, a lack of accountability, inadequate resources, and an overly adversarial process for parents. In essence, the investigation revealed huge illegalities and fragmentations within the delivery of important SEND services. At the localised level, research by myself, my co-presenter Amel, and another colleague of ours, Deborah Tyfield, from the Liverpool Law Clinic, into service provision for children and young people with disabilities in the Liverpool and Merseyside area. This investigation also unearthed further evidence of a system which was characterised by gross illegalities also. We uncovered systemic practices of delay, a lack of specification in children's EHC plans when they were produced, a lack of social care and respite services for parents. We uncovered incidents of huge and immense family stress. This incorporated both personal stress, but also financial stress also, in that very many of the parents and families that we spoke to had to personally pay for specialist clinical and legal services to enable them avail of the services which their children required. We also uncovered evidence of illegal school exclusions, which disproportionately impacted children with SEND. And we uncovered also clear evidence of communication and transparency failures right across the board. This investigation was a qualitative investigation based on 17 semi-structured interviews and a review of the case files from the Liverpool Law Clinic. And that investigation at the localised level supplements and corroborates the evidence which has been adduced at the national level in relation to the precarious state of children with SEND and their rights. So just in relation to COVID-19, it's important at this particular point to convey and outline what has been the government response in relation to children's SEND rights and services. The first thing to note is that the government have officially downgraded Section 42 of the Children and Families Act 2014. They have formally altered and diluted the legal content of that provision. This has moved from an absolute duty to provide what's outlined in an EHC plan to a reasonable endeavours duty. Problematically, however, there is no clear guidance on what this duty entails. There is no clear elaboration by the government as to what reasonable endeavours means. What is clear, however, though, is that it is a vague, subjectively opaque provision which clearly waters down the rights of children with SEND. And despite repeated calls from the international community, including the UN Children's Rights Committee and the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both of whom have encouraged countries to adopt a rights-based approach in their responses to COVID-19, the response of the English government has been to downgrade the legal entitlements of children with SEND. No impact assessment has ever been carried out to foresee what the impact of this downgrading would have, and we would argue and contend that it will have a severe and long-lasting effect on children with special educational needs and disabilities. Problematically also, this revised duty remains in force until the end of July 2020. It has been in operation for the past 3 months, and a possible extension, it can be extended after the end of July also. So this leads us on to our investigation. Against this canvas, we wanted to find out what exactly was happening on the ground for children and young people with SEND and their families. So we carried out an online survey, which was completed by 234 parents. 229 parents came from England, 4 from Wales, 1 from Scotland. And the purpose of the online survey was to explore and understand the impact which COVID-19 was having on children with SEND, and indeed its impact on the wider family unit. This survey was completed online between April and May 2020, and we received ethical approval to carry out this investigation by the University of Liverpool Ethics Committee. Overall, the evidence revealed the devastating impact which COVID-19 is having on children and young people with SEND right across a number of areas. And we would argue that unless robust interventions are enacted, we fear that a generation of children and young people will suffer unnecessarily and in fact disproportionately. 234 children were implicated within this investigation, as some parents had more than one child with a special educational need or disability. And the average age of the child within this investigation was 10.6 years of age, so just over 10.5 years. So just looking further at a breakdown of some of the data within this investigation. Overall, 53% of the children involved had a primary diagnosis of autism. Other disabilities, they included a range of physical disabilities, moderate and severe learning difficulties, and emotional, social and behavioural disorders also. The needs of the children were often varied, complex and multiple. And what we observed within the data was that very often children presented with a range of disabilities. In terms of the education of these children, we were curious to ascertain where they were being educated. And the findings from that reveal that 53% of the children involved attended a mainstream school, 33.6% were attending a specialist school, 0.5% were home educated, 0.9% attended either an alternative provision centre or a pupil referral unit, and 11% of the respondents fell into the category described as other. Now, arguably, this could entail a post-16 institution or a nursery. 74.5% of the respondents possessed an EHC plan, but crucially, of these, 21.9% conveyed overwhelming dissatisfaction with their child's education, health and care plan. And the reasons for that dissatisfaction tended to revolve around the fact that their child's plan was vague, not quantified, was not specific enough, or was too vague. Crucially, 94.9% of the parents informed us that their local authority had not been in contact with them since their since the period of entering lockdown. And 89.9% of the respondents whose child had an education, health and care plan stated that no SEND risk assessment had been carried out. This is extremely significant, as the government had previously stated within their guidance that children on an EHC plan would have a risk assessment carried out to determine whether or not their needs could be safely met at school or not. And we contend that failing to carry out the risk assessment, that has meant that hundreds, if not thousands of children are having essential education, health and care services disrupted unnecessarily. Further evidence from the survey revealed huge variation in the level of contact that parents had from school or from their child's educational provider. And what we've seen was that 14.7% of the parents reported absolutely no contact at all from their child's educational provider. 13% reported daily contact, 42% reported weekly contact, 12.1% reported fortnightly contact, and 22.5% reported contact falling into the category which was listed as other. So within that data set, what we see is huge variation in relation to the level of contact. Regarding the level of educational instruction and provision itself, which was provided since the closure of the schools on the 20th of March 2020, again we have clear evidence of inconsistency. 46.9% of the parents told us that they were extremely and overwhelmingly dissatisfied with the education which had been provided for their child since lockdown. There was again huge variation in relation to what was provided. This varied from instances where no provision at all was provided to situations where the work was too generic, not differentiated, and not specific to the needs or the abilities of the child concerned. And I'm just going to outline two of the responses from the parents, which illuminates that reality. One of the parents responded, none, no support, no phone calls, nothing. I teach him myself. While another parent stated, none. My daughter usually has full-time one-to-one support in school to access a differentiated curriculum and social, behavioural, emotional targets. However, 48.2% of the respondents replied in generic terms about the level of provision their child was receiving. This tended to revolve around the fact that the school had emailed them, texted them, or posted out the work, or that they had made a personal call to the family in question. And we see that from the response outlined below, where one of the parents said, brilliant, school has provided lessons from home. So one can extrapolate from the data set, which is divided down the middle, where we have huge variation in relation to the provision of educational instruction which children with SEND have received since the closure of the school. And I want to move on to the impact which COVID-19 has had on the physical, mental and social health of children with special educational needs and disabilities. Overall, the survey evidence unequivocally suggests that COVID-19 and the resultant closure of schools is having a detrimental and injurious impact on the physical, mental and social health of children with SEND. Only 12.2% of the respondents answered somewhat positively, with the majority stating that either their child's anxiety had reduced or that their happiness had improved by staying at home. This, of course, raises the broader inverted issue of why attending school makes children anxious and unhappy in the first instance. But we did not explore that within this survey. However, an overwhelming amount of respondents, 87.8% of the respondents, gave compelling evidential accounts of deterioration, regression and backsliding regarding their children's overall educational, health and social well-being. And two of the responses below outline the sheer magnitude of that level of regression. In the first response outlined, the parent told us, behaviour is terrible, very violent to self and others, no routine, regressed in food aversion, not sleeping, refusing to get dressed and washed, very controlling. While another parent told us he is suicidal and deeply disturbed. He doesn't really understand what is happening. The LA don't care at all. Further evidence of that backsliding was clear within the survey. And overall, what we observed was declining mental health, increased anxiety, social regression, behavioural breakdowns, and a cessation and disruption of essential health and therapeutic services such as speech and language services, respite care, and occupational therapy were recurrent themes within the responses received. And here are some of the evidence which we received from the parents. No respite for 4 weeks. No therapies my son usually receives. His mental health has bottomed. No guidance from local authority. Another parent told us, it is having a devastating effect. Young sibling is being attacked, mental health is suffering, and child has become mute. We've had no support from CAMS despite self-harm. Another parent told us, my child is bored and sad with the isolation. She misses her usual routine and she misses going to school and seeing people. We are unable to provide the same level of stimulation at home. While another parent conveyed their subjective worries about what would happen in relation to reintegrating their child back into school. And they told us that reintegration is going to be an enormous struggle. So overall, the evidence suggests that COVID-19 is having a detrimental impact on children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And one of those points of impact is their mental health, their social health, and their behavioural well-being. So just to conclude, the effect on children's educational rights and their wider emotional, social and behavioural well-being will likely endure long beyond COVID-19. We would argue there is now an urgent need for the restoration of their legal rights to ensure that children with special educational needs and disabilities have their rights foregrounded and centralised as part of the national governmental response to COVID-19. However, we also contend that this investigation is really only the tip of the iceberg, and rather we need to consider broader intersectional investigations which examine the interface of COVID-19 with issues such as class, race, gender and poverty to ascertain the real impact which COVID-19 is having on children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. We would further contend that a broader intersectional investigation is required to ensure that the responses which are subsequently enacted not only account for, but remediate and alleviate those critical intersectional realities. And we look forward to discussing those further with you. Thank you very much for listening to our paper this afternoon, and we look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seamus and Amel, for your presentation. Yes, that was really a lot, I think, to take in, and also it's if I can speak so freely, I think it also sort of resonates with other signals that we've been hearing about how neurodivergent adults are suffering during COVID-19, and we can say medical and ableist discrimination experiencing in a complex field. So this, and it's really clear that this sort of this is something that you're identifying as well, if I understand correctly. We are reaching 5 o'clock, so I want to really briefly perhaps ask one question. If people from the audience have some questions, then feel free to put this in the Q&A box as well. And hopefully, Amel and Seamus, you are open to receiving perhaps emails with questions if people want to consult you, because I also think that we have to realize how important it is that people from a legal perspective are studying this and can support others who are doing work around this. Yeah, so I actually had the question, you actually touched on this in the end, and this is with our pre-existing knowledge about how send children neurodivergent and children with learning difficulties, intellectual disabilities, and sort of what the role is of gender and of race inequalities and class inequalities. And I was wondering whether when we look at this 50-50 split, I was wondering if there's any relation with this 50-50 split, who are basically suffering most, if you will.
I'll just jump in firstly, and Amel perhaps can jump in after if I leave anything out. But that's a really excellent question, G. And what we know, I suppose, from the figures nationally, is that when it comes to intellectual disabilities, from children and an adolescent perspective, boys statistically will outnumber girls. And just to be a bit more sort of localized, here in the Liverpool area, we just have under 14,000 children with special educational needs and disabilities. 2/3 of those are boys. So that'll give you a breakdown in relation to gender. In relation to the class and to the class issue, I think that's also connected with the broader issue of poverty. Now, children and young people who are in receipt of free school meals, which is itself a proxy for poverty, they are also statistically and disproportionately more likely to be in the category of SEND. I should also say that SEND is a very broad term in law, and it traverses the physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and also the broader emotional, cognitive, and developmental issues. But it's important also to remember that a recent study by Young Minds informs us that children and adolescents with a learning difficulty are 6 times more likely also to have a psychiatric disorder. So Amel and I are also very keen to explore those broader intersectional connections and relations. And I think it's important, while admittedly we are both lawyers and we approach this from a legal perspective, we're very keen to open up those broader discussions to explore those intersectional and critical realities in terms of discrimination, in terms of class, gender, poverty, gender.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add on that as well, some of the research we're also looking at is a large number of children who have special needs are excluded from school, either lawfully or unlawfully, because the school can't cope with that child's needs. And we're looking at how a disproportionate number of those are also from the BME category, where they're more likely to be excluded. And then obviously we know about the research about, you know, if you leave school with no qualifications, the links in the pipeline to the criminal justice system. So all the factors are interlinked, and we are trying to broaden our knowledge on how the sociological research feeds into our research.
Thank you. It is an area that I'm running 2 reading groups, and the school to prison pipeline is one of the things that we're really concerned with, sort of trying to educate ourselves. And it would be really, I think, important perhaps to organize another webinar specifically around that. I know that others, well, in adjacent communities are really concerned with the intersection with racism and school exclusion and neuroableism or ableism as well. So maybe we can think about this for the future. I have here one last question that I wanted to ask, and I think we'll wrap it up then. And there's a question from the audience, so I'm just going to read this out loud. Why weren't local authorities prosecuted before COVID if they were breaking the law? And what role does a lack of funding play?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I'll start off with the second question first, the lack of funding. The lack of funding is absolutely critical. And we've had very many judicial review challenges to local authorities right across the country, where parents in conjunction with various charities and organizations are challenging local authorities in relation to the lack of funding. Legally speaking, public authorities or local authorities have a large, what's called a margin of appreciation within which to distribute public funds. And legally speaking, in this country, the courts have been very reluctant to trespass into what's called the allocative autonomy that public authorities and local authorities have. The courts are very deferential to the public purse, as it were, and they're very reticent to trespass into those spaces to tell local authorities how to spend their money or where it should be spent. But therein is also a challenge for us as lawyers and us as from like civic society to continuously challenge that perception and that mindset. We can learn from other jurisdictions who have challenged the public allocation of funds. We have lessons from South Africa, from Colombia and Argentina. And I think that also feeds into the broader issue of the decolonization of our approaches to challenging these issues. And there are a lot of lessons that we as lawyers can learn from the Southern Hemispheric states that have progressive approaches to legalism. On the first issue, why weren't local authorities prosecuted? Again, that feeds into the broader overarching question of the margin of appreciation which they possess. I would argue there's massive scope and there's an obligation on us to continuously challenge that reality. I should say actually that as we sit here this afternoon, there are 2 judicial reviews earmarked for the end of the month to challenge the government's behaviour. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But while the courts are on the one hand reluctant to trespass into that public space in relation to funds and money, on the other hand, we do have a very active civil society that are continuously challenging. So hopefully we can make some inroads in that. But it's a very excellent question. If Amel wants to add anything.
I think as well, the reality is that some regional areas were hit more with the budget cuts, and Liverpool was one of them. And the reality is specialist school places cost money that the Liverpool local authorities simply don't have. So it ended up in a situation where the law isn't a very good mechanism to challenge this. So it's a public law remedy in which you bring judicial review. And then a lot of the parents, the reality is a lot of the parents, they've had to fight to get an educational healthcare plan. They've had to fight and wait years for a diagnosis. And then the idea that they're going to fight again to take a local authority or a school to court, most of the ones that we meet, they've lost the, they've just lost the will, the capacity, they're exhausted of having fought for years. So a lot of them don't end up in the Sen Tribunal for that reason, and people struggle for years. I mean, some of the parents Seamus and I interviewed had a child out of education for 2 years waiting for an educational healthcare plan. So as soon as they got it, they were so relieved of finally having a school place. Them trying to bring a legal action against the local authority wasn't within their, their contemplation. And I think sometimes, in theory, the law says you can do X, Y, Z, but we're dealing with real human beings who are just exhausted, having to constantly navigate the system to get basic, fundamental healthcare services. And I think that's the reality.
Thanks for thanks for emphasizing the complexity, I think, and the multi-level reality of this situation, and also of protest and change, and how we can think, not only think, but actually contribute to change. Yeah.
G, if I could just pop in before you go, I think when
very
you mentioned, very briefly, I think when you mentioned your work in relation to how children end up in the criminal justice system and end up in like prisons and so on, that's something that definitely Amel and I would be very keen to develop further. So if you were to open up kind of further discussions or webinars, we'd be very interested to discuss those further and to develop that line of thinking and how we can sort of work together collectively, both legally, sociologically, and otherwise.
It's not my own work. We're reading on it, but I would be happy to think along and how we can sort of like create a webinar around this or something. Yeah,
and just to very finally add, with a colleague of ours, Deborah Tyfield, we've just submitted freedom of information requests to lots of public authorities and schools about exact exclusion rates and the identity of those excluded. And I think sometimes having those really up-to-date statistics and those freedom of information requests can help also our sociological academics who are working in the field. So it's good to share those resources and information when they come in. And if anyone wants to access the report that Seamus and I did, it was published by the Government Education Committee last week. And we'd be happy to share the statistics that we've mentioned today.
Do you want to put it in the chat? If you're free to just add it to the chat so that other people can access it as well. Yeah. Okay, is there any, Sarah, do you have any questions?
Yes, I would just add, I mean, this was reported on in the news yesterday. Is this your report or?
No, the Guardian article yesterday wasn't ours.
Okay. But
it wasn't ours, yeah.
Okay, but it's really good to see this research being done. It's really important because these are the kinds of services, it seems to me, that we're supposed to continue and support for children throughout the COVID pandemic, and there are clearly many problems. So thank you so much for raising it.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yes, well, thanks everyone for your presentation. Stefan, who is probably finished his breakfast right now in Canada, and Seamus and Amel for your presentation, and really interesting and very important contribution as well today, and Lindsay for your work at the background, and Sarah also for all the other things and co-hosting. So this is the second of a series of 5. And next week the topic will be intersectional inequalities, as well as in the 5th week. So yeah, we look forward to those presentations as well. And yes, I think that's it for now, unless I forgot something. And yeah, we'll next week same time, 3:45 on a Thursday. And hopefully we see each other again around in a seminar on the education and intersectional inequalities.
Definitely.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.